In a week when parents in England celebrated the end of homeschooling, my phone just dropped. Piers Morgan left his role in Good Morning Britain, and a certain YouTube channel got to celebrate the fact that
it's over 9,000
views. What more would you want from a podcast with two blokes going on a journey to Middlebrook? Sorry, Middle Earth. Hello, wherever you're listening or watching, and welcome to the Rip Ticket Review, a film and TV podcast that does not simply walk into Mordor. My name's Jack Smit, and joining me over the power of the internet is the Gandalf to my Gollum. Good afternoon, Dan Carver.
Hello there. Wow, Gollum. Damn.
Well, I couldn't think of a decent Lord of the Rings pun. I couldn't think of a decent pun.
Frodo? I don't know.
Wait, yeah, you are the expert today. You are the expert. In a little role reversal, last episode it was me taking lead on Back to the Future. This week, the man himself is going to take us on a journey into, as he admitted last week, his favourite trilogy.
It is easily my favourite trilogy. I mean, where to start but the Inscription. One ring to rule them all, one ring to find them, one ring to bring them all, and in the darkness bind them. Lord of the Rings is an epic trilogy of books. It was originally written as one book by J.R. Tolkien, and it was written as a sequel to his children's story, The Hobbit.
Yep, and with the Hobbit, people think that The Hobbit is a kid's book, but it's very heavily within the fantasy realm, and that's what's with this particular trilogy. And we'll get on to the ins and outs of it a little bit later on. People think that it's very fantasy heavy, but it's right to be fantasy heavy because this whole world has got a lot of mythos and lore building to it.
The Hobbit is still a children's fantasy novel in the same vein as the Chronicles of Narnia is written for children. But adults can enjoy it too because of the themes that are there. It's one of those books that you read, and I would also include Animal Farm in this. It's one of those books which you read, and you think, oh, it's talking animals and all this sort of stuff and craziness. But then when you get older, if you really look deep into it, you realize it's a genius story. And so yeah, The Hobbit, or There and Back Again, The Hobbit's Tale, it is a children's fantasy novel, and Tolkien wanted to go back to that world, and he created The Lord of the Rings, which is a very well-known trilogy of books. There's not much in the fantasy genre that Lord of the Rings hasn't inspired. One could argue it is the proto sort of genesis of what we know as heroic fantasy.
Yep.
To the point where it's that that whole sort of idea of fantasy with the elves and the hobbits and the lush green land and the trees and the wizards, that is now known as Tolkien fantasy. And ever since those books came out, Hollywood had attempted to make movies out of them. There have been 3 adaptations of Lord of the Rings. So the first one was in 1978 by Ralph Bakshi, who was an American animator, and he created The Lord of the Rings in 1978, which was originally meant to be a 2-part adaptation of the story. It actually holds up really well still. If you watch it, it's really, really good. But the audiences were cheated a little bit because it was called The Lord of the Rings, and everyone assumed, oh, Lord of the Rings, it's gonna tell the whole trilogy. And at the end, obviously, it's a to be continued, and everyone was like, "Oh, that's a real bummer."
Probably because they wanted to see how it would do before they actually would eventually go on to make Fellowship of Two Towers and the whole setup. Obviously, where we know it would take quite a few years more for that to happen.
Which is a bit of a weird one because if you're going to do a part 1, you put part 1 in the name. And that's kind of the point that Ralph Bakshi made. He pointed out that actually he wanted to call it The Lord of the Rings Part 1 so that people would know it would be a Part 1. And I think that would have saved the film and made a Part 2. Alas, it was not meant to be. There was one in 1980, an adaptation called The Return of the King. Now, many people confuse this as a sequel to Ralph Bakshi's 1978 animated film. It's not. Warner Brothers acquired the rights for home video and distribution, and it was directed by Arthur Rankin Jr. and Jules Bass. Again, it does hold up. It's not as good as the previous versions, but it was a sequel to that people wanted, I guess. And I mean, I've never watched it before, so there's not really much I can say. It was 8 years before my time. And then for a while, many people tried to adapt the works of Tolkien. Walt Disney, William Snyder, Forrest J. Ackerman, Dennis O'Dell, Peter Shaffer, John Borman, George Lucas. And all of these attempts didn't work because the sheer scope of Lord of the Rings is huge. Budgetary cut, the budget was scary for some people. And what you'd often find is that they'd come up with a working budget, and then Hollywood were like, "Oh, no way, we're not filming that." And so what would happen is the director would take what they'd have, and they would essentially create original fantasy films instead with some of the unproduced concept art and scripts. And that's how we've got films like Excalibur and Willow. These were essentially meant to be Lord of the Rings movies, but it just didn't work. Another one, John Borman, as I said, attempted to create Lord of the Rings, and it didn't work. He created Zardoz with some of the concept art, which is the Sean Connery science fiction. Very weird film. But then for a while, that's pretty much all it was. Enter Peter Jackson.
Yep, enter Peter Jackson, who up to this point made some very experimental independent film. Based in New Zealand, he'd been like a fan of these books for all of his life, and he thought, I think I should be the one to give it a go. And getting the financing in place was an absolute task in and of itself. Getting a cast as big and as varied as this, also quite a big task. But in the end, he would eventually revolutionise the way fantasy films are made within Hollywood, because since Fellowship came out in 2001, you've seen these generic conventions sort of get applied to various other different movies, and people have tried, people have failed. Even Peter Jackson himself, who we thought would never come back, he came back to do The Hobbit in 2012, to do another trilogy based on the original books. So this adaptation of Lord of the Rings is quite rightly held in critical regard.
Now, it's important to understand that when Jackson was announced, a lot of the eyes were sort of waggling as if to say, really? Interesting. Because he did win an award for Best Original Screenplay with his partner Fran Walsh for Heavenly Creatures, which was released in 1994. It's a biographical drama film. And it was based on the notorious 1954 murder case of Parker Hume, the Parker Hume murder in Christchurch, and this brought him into the public eye. Before then, he was pretty much known for his splatstick horror comedies, which had buckets and buckets and buckets and buckets and buckets and buckets and buckets of blood in them. I mean, one of them during his splatter taste, I believe, was called Brain Dead, which that
is the most iconic one that he made pre-Lord of the Rings, because everyone still talks about it to this day.
To this day, yeah, because it's one of the goriest films that have ever been made. It's a horror comedy full of zombies and limbs being ripped off, buckets of bloods.
A perfect Halloween film. A very perfect Halloween film.
Yeah. A kung fu priest who has one of the funniest lines ever. It's almost the best way to describe it is the version of anything George Romero would have made. It's almost no good thing. Yeah, I mean, I'm gonna get. If you compare it to Romero, then obviously you've got to hold it in very high regard. Yeah, because Romero obviously tried to make statements with his movies, and they worked, but there was no such statement with Brain Dead or any of the Splatterhouse movies. It was literally comedy which involved blood and guts going everywhere. It contained lots of humor which alienated a lot of people. It was as if, it was those movies were if George A. Romero were in his frat boy stage, basically, and it worked. So a lot of people were looking at Peter Jackson and say, "Oh, really? Can he do Lord of the Rings? Is it possible?" And he did, and it was brilliant. And I hold these films in such high regard. I hold the whole fantasy genre in high regard because it seems oddly fitting to talk about this personal link on Mother's Day. As my mum and my nan are both heavily sort of into the fantasy genre themselves. So that's where I sort of get that from. I think my first foray into the fantasy genre, from what I can remember, was Prince Valiant, which was a comic strip about one of King Arthur's knights. But I used to have a book kicking around somewhere of the whole entire sort of saga of Excalibur. And Viking Norse stories and Greek myths. I kind of get that from my mum, bless her. And I didn't have a really great time in school. I didn't like most of my schoolmates at all, and they didn't like me. The difference was they were more vocal about it, whereas I kept it to myself. Gits. And so yeah, I sort of retreated into sort of the fantasy genre, the books, the Harry Potters, that sort of thing. And it was quite a nice sort of comfort, a great little bit of escapism.
I mean, fantasy is the one genre that kind of does that for everyone, really, because I've had experience with the Harry Potter books in the past. Obviously, I'm not a fan of the Harry Potter films. The books were great. The films, bit iffy about them all these years on.
I'm watching a lot of clips from the Harry Potter films recently. I don't know why, but yeah. And it was the fantasy genre is a really great escape tool. And the problem was with the fantasy genre, I couldn't really explain to people what I liked about the fantasy genre because nobody got it. It was mostly books and books and books. When you look at the fantasy genre in terms of movies, you just had those cheesy movies to look back to, and some of those movies, let's face it, weren't exactly kid friendly.
No.
Barbarian fantasies and stuff like that, which contained a lot, a lot of the R word. The main hero going around, because he's a barbarian, big manly barbarian, he gets to have his way with women. So it was just all books and so I hold these trilogy of movies in high regard because the thing about an adaptation, a lot of people go, oh, Hollywood wants to keep adapting things, and it's like, yeah, but that's not necessarily a bad thing, because when Hollywood does an adaptation really well, what they're doing is they're introducing this whole new world that has always existed to people who may not be able to access it in its original form. Because let's face it, if we're talking about the Lord of the Rings books, they are lengthy.
Yeah.
And J.R.R. Tolkien's writing style, he leaves nothing out. He puts the lyrics to all the songs that they sing. He puts in great detail how they replenish their ammunition. Legolas going around saying, "Oh, I'm out of arrows. I must replenish them by taking them from the orcs." You couldn't write Tolkien style anymore. It would be an editor's nightmare.
Yeah, Tolkien really wanted you to put you in this completely new world, add to that immersion a little bit more, and that's one of the strengths of the original books, is how it does this, transporting you over to actual Middle-earth really well, and the films do that. I mean, you say go lengthy. If you watch the theatrical cuts of the films, we're talking 9 hours of cinema here, extended, but that's before we get onto the whole debate over the extended versions.
And then life is a little bit more simpler. We didn't have the internet, and we didn't have loads of stuff at our disposal. People were willing to take their time, and I think the writing style of J.R.R. Tolkien really heavily emphasizes that. Nowadays, you wouldn't be able to do it. People would just be skipping it over, but that's just because we're an impatient species now. And so with Lord of the Rings, I really hold these in great regard because it introduced the world of Frodo Baggins, Bilbo Baggins, Gandalf the Grey, all of this it introduced to the mainstream audience, and people got it. People got it straight off the bat. They were glued to their seats watching as this beautiful Middle Earth was unveiled before them with such heavyweight actors. Elijah Wood as Bilbo Baggins. What a casting choice that is. Perfect. So Ian McKellen, Gandalf the Grey, Sir Christopher Lee, Saruman the White. These are heavyweight actors, people, and you know, the first film, it's difficult to put how much of an explosion that caused in the public domain, in the public hemisphere. For the because everyone was just like, whoa, this was big.
Yeah.
This was huge. I don't know how I can put it. There's no words that I can describe. And it was really wonderful for me to see, even at that young age. Because it came out, just trying to think of when it came out now.
2001, I think.
2001, my God, 20 years ago. I would have been, I'm 31, 21, 11? No, that can't be right. I have to have a look and see. Yeah, 2001. My gosh. So that would have been what? That's 20 years ago.
20, yeah.
So I would have been 11. Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah. So, it's a great, the Lord of the Rings trilogy is brilliant. And, it's good when the Church of New Mexico in 2001 burns the book and claims it's satanic.
Yeah, that's a sign of a good book. That's a sign of a good book.
Satan's got the good taste. Sorry to,
sorry to offend.
I respect your beliefs and stuff.
The views and opinions expressed in this podcast do not reflect those of TheJackSmit Ventures or any employer or cinema or educational institution. Yeah, I've got backs covered.
Yeah, it's not Jack's view. But yeah, that's what happened. So
we're just stating the facts. The book was burned by a church. That's what happened.
It was burned by a new church in New Mexico because it was considered satanic. And they did not the church, but the church did the same thing to D&D. They claimed that was satanic. And
you don't do that to D&D. Come on.
Well, no, that's what they did. So where do we even be? I say this a lot, I really do, but where do we even begin with the Lord of the Rings: The Fellowship of the Ring? 2001. Again, it was a simple time. The internet in its infancy.
It's important to note before we do launch into the films, from a production standpoint, this is one of the first major trilogies that was filmed back to back over the same period. So nobody knew, even though you know the books, nobody knew when the split for each film was going to be. So it really kept the anticipation going for each part.
Okay. So, right, I didn't know. Oh, there you go. So yeah, films were filmed, like you say, they were filmed back to back, and there was a really good reason for it as well, because quite frankly, these films are cumbersome. There's no way you're going to be able to pack everything back and film it again later. We are going, full into this, and that's a very wise move.
It also keeps the ability to have the cast tied down for all three films, so they don't have to head off to other projects mid-production, like has been the case on other significant franchises that have spawned out of Lord of the Rings' success and the blueprint of how to make production happen.
Yeah. So I don't know. My mind has just gone blank. That's terrible. Jack, would you be able to take over for a little bit, or do you have anything?
Yeah, well, I can sort of give you like a brief summary of what happens in Fellowship. We're introduced to Middle-earth. We learn of the Dark Lord Sauron, who seeks the One Ring to rule them all. The ring has found its way to the young hobbit Frodo Baggins. The fate of Middle-earth hangs in the balance as Frodo and 8 companions, who we learn to be the Fellowship of the Ring, begin their journey to Mount Doom in the land of Mordor, the only place where the ring can be destroyed. This is your first film of exposition. This is you building your backstory up. Because ultimately, as we've said, Lord of the Rings is a big time investment if you want to watch it. This first film comes in at just under 3 hours, which at the time was unheard of for a multiplex cinema. A lot of managers were like, how are we going to fit as many showings of this film in as we can to what Warner want us? I wasn't involved in the industry back then. I only got involved in the industry after Return of the King came out, I think.
Yeah.
And I remember at the time projection managers sweating at how many times they had to show this film and keep everything running smoothly. Because this, was a big film to assemble, it was a big film to make, and a big film in terms of what was riding on it. Because if it did well, then there wouldn't be an issue in terms of getting Two Towers and Return of the King out. So it really did, unlike the animated film, they knew that they were going to make the film. It's just whether the audiences were going to come out in hundreds and millions and thousands, which they did, thank God, and whether it would actually be a commercial success.
Yeah. And fortunately, as I alluded to, it's helmed by an incredible cast. With Elijah Wood as Frodo Baggins and Ian McKellen as Gandalf the Grey, though not the first choice. Sean Connery was approached for the role, but he didn't understand the plot, and so he turned it down. Patrick Stewart turned it down because he didn't like the script, and so they cast McKellen.
But let's be real. Can you imagine anyone other than McKellen in that role all these years on?
Absolutely not. He was brilliant as Gandalf the Grey, and obviously his transformed state Gandalf the White. He based his accent on Tolkien himself, and he really enjoyed it, and it was wonderful because I had a comic of The Hobbit because it was done in a graphic novel. And I have to say, McKellen practically nailed the part. And then, of course, the second best actor, in my opinion, Viggo Mortensen as Strider, or Aragon Elessar II, who's a Dunedain Ranger. Again, not the first person to be offered this. It was originally offered to Daniel Day-Lewis, the greatest actor ever.
Yep.
Bar none.
The amount of Oscars he's had says it all.
Yeah, well, Daniel Day-Lewis is my favourite male actor, and Tilda Swinton is my favourite female.
Oh, yeah, solid choices.
But yeah, Daniel Day-Lewis was offered the part, but he turned it down. Nicolas Cage
was my God,
offer, but declined it because of family obligations. I think that would have failed straight off the bat. And Vin Diesel, a fan of the book, because of course he's a massive fantasy nerd, auditioned for Aragon. But then Stuart Townsend was originally cast in the role, but he was replaced during filming when Jackson realised that he was too young. Russell Crowe was considered a replacement, but he'd just come off Gladiator, and he was like, no, I don't want to do a similar movie.
And Gladiator was the biggest film of the year before, so people would have instantly typecast him.
Yep. And then Daniel Day-Lewis was offered it a second time, but he declined again. And legends say that you don't offer Daniel Day-Lewis the same thing 3 times. It just doesn't work. And then, obviously, they were at a loss. They were like, well, who's going to play Aragorn? We kind of need it. And then executive producer Mard Odeskay saw Viggo Mortensen in a play. And it was Mortensen's son, a fan who was a massive fan of the book, convinced him to take the role. And I think that's really funny because if you look at all the people who do these fantasy books and novels, it's always their children that convince them, isn't it?
Yeah, it's almost like they want
or
to.
The children or the grandchildren in the case of Richard Harris and Dumbledore.
I think it might be. I know. It seems to be the case with a lot of these fantasy films. It's like the children of the talent really empowers them to go off and make it. And with Lord of the Rings, it's quite a big thing because there wasn't any sort of like major thing outside of the books and radio adaptations in terms of adaptations of the material. So I think that was probably what motivated Mortensen to say, "Oh yeah, I hear you've been offered Lord of the Rings. Take it. Don't do it for the world. Do it for me. Do it for me. Give me something to go back on when I'm older."
Yeah. It's also fun to say as well, to look at it and be like, oh, that's my granddad playing Dumbledore, or that's my father playing Mortensen. It's kind of one up on the whole whose dad is cooler scale. And of course, Mortensen, very dedicated to the role. He became a hit with the crew because he kept patching up his costume rather than taking it off and getting it repaired. He sorted it out himself. And he also carried his sword around with him off camera rather than giving it back to the props.
And that's how you stay in character for the duration of a shoot and boost morale. That's really good.
He also ran off the fish in between shots. And there was also that incident as well where he had I think it was an actual prop dagger thrown at his face.
Ooh.
And he swung with his sword and deflected it. And that was the actual take that they used.
Oh, This is another example of why Lord of the Rings is still held up in very high regard, because while it's a very CG-heavy film, whatever could be done in camera was done in camera.
Yep. But that was the urban legend. He had to deflect a knife that was accidentally thrown at him. Yeah, that's how the story goes. Let's have a quick look here. I don't know whether that's true or not, but if it is, what we do know is true, however, is in the second film when Mortensen kicks one of the helmets, he breaks his toe.
Oh.
He screams and he goes, ah! And he goes to his knees, and again they use that. Yeah, people got mucked up in this.
Yeah.
Sean Astin as Samwise Gamgee, better known as Sam. And then, of course, we had Billy Boyd and Dominic Monaghan as Peregrine Took and Meriadoc Brandybuck, the distant cousins and relations of Frodo. And, of course, one of my favourite actors, Sir Christopher Lee as Saruman the White, who was the only person who met J.R.R. Tolkien. And he originally auditioned for Gandalf, but his age, he was judged too old, and so they went with
McKellen.
But yeah, they said he have Saruman the White, and again, interesting tale about Christopher Lee in the deleted scene in the third movie where he is stabbed in the back. Peter Jackson sort of tried to direct the scene and say, this is what I want you to say, or do, this is the sound I want you to make when you're stabbed in the back. And Christopher Lee asked him, said, do you have any idea what it sounds like to be stabbed in the back when someone gets stabbed in the back? Because I do. Because, of course, no, seriously, Sir Christopher Lee during World War II, was a part of several
yes.
And as a result, he sort of directed Peter Jackson as actually the sound you make is because it's the breath leaving your lungs. And nobody argued with him.
Because you don't argue with Christopher Lee. You never argue with Christopher Lee.
No one ever argues with Christopher Lee on these things. And there's this really beautiful video on YouTube. It's one of my favorite videos where he gets a birthday present from, I think, a journalist, because Christopher Lee collected Special Forces badges, and he was missing a German one, and he couldn't find it. No matter how hard he tried, he just couldn't get for it, and somebody got it for him, and it's such a beautiful video. You could just tell you can just tell he's gobsmacked.
Right, edit point for me in the podcast. Try and find that clip and push it out on Rip Ticket socials after the show. Thank you, future me.
Yeah. But it was because and he also talked as well. Christopher Lee talked about how he carried an identity card with him as well from the World War II that let him get onto military bases. So if he ever needed to go onto a military base, Christopher Lee, what a legend. So then we of course had the Lord of the Rings: The Fellowship of the Ring was released. It was released to a stunning critical reception.
Yep.
A lot of people. The agreement was it's not the perfect J.R.R. Tolkien adaptation, but it's the best we're going to get.
Yeah, because I know
excellent.
Because I know Peter and his screenwriters sort of merged a couple of characters into sort of like composite characters just to get the runtime of the film down a little bit and sort of simplify the plot. It's still a ridiculously complex plot for a 3-hour movie, but it has time to breathe. You can't do a plot like that under 3 hours. People have tried, people have failed, but 3 hours felt like the perfect running time. And again, this is theatrical talking about here. They added so much stuff on the VHS and DVD release the year after, and that's what the fans really loved about this movie, is he kept adding stuff to it. Unlike Star Wars, where the additions that were made hindered the film, Peter Jackson actually holds the extended versions as the more definitive version of the film, because A, he didn't have to abide by the PG-13 in the States, so he could show a lot more, and B, anything that didn't go down well at cinema level well, he could just rip it out for home video and put an extended alternative version of the scene in.
And this
Smart
is
way of doing it.
Yeah, and this is it's kind of the opposite of what Zack Snyder does, where Zack Snyder releases an incomplete film and then sells people the complete version, doesn't he?
Which is quite apt because Justice League is on HBO Max this week.
Yeah, well, Justice League I've given a pass because the one that was released wasn't really his version, so he's actually got a real good reason to release his version out there. But the rest of them, I think, it set off this sort of trend, which I think was kind of morally wrong, because when you pay for a movie, you want the complete movie.
Yep.
You don't pay for a product which is incomplete. And I just think it was wrong of Zack Snyder to release the definitive versions of Batman v Superman, the definitive versions of this film, the definitive versions of that film, with the exception of Justice League, because of course he had to take some time off due to extremely personal reasons, which we're not going to go into.
But we're finally getting his version of the film this week, at long last.
Yeah, but it had to be taken over by...
It was Whedon. It was Whedon.
Joss Whedon, yeah. So there's actually a good reason for him to release his version. But in the case of The Lord of the Rings, yeah, you're right. It was a complete product. It was released in the theaters. It was beautifully done. Sound was gorgeous. The cinematography was amazing. There were moments where people welled up because of the relationship between Frodo and Samwise Gamgee.
Yeah, it's testament to those performances. Still hold up 20 years on.
And I mean, it was made for about just under 95 million. And the box office was 888.3 million. That should tell you everything. So of course a sequel was made. Of course there's going to be a sequel. And like you say, one of the things that works about that I have such a high regard in this trilogy is it was filmed back to back to back. It was brilliant because of course it's not just about making sure that the actors are ready for their parts and that there's no there's no conflict in schedules. It's also as well making sure that the actors don't leave their characters and they can get straight back onto it. And when you come back to The Lord of the Rings in 2002 with the Two Towers, I've got to tell you, it doesn't feel like you've left.
Yeah, I mean, with good production, they only really broke to do good PR and publicity for Fellowship. But coming back to Two Towers, with the hype that was around the film in 2002, people thought, well, we know what we're letting ourselves in for now. Let's go and watch this film. And once again, the world was not disappointed. Same cast, same cinematographer, Howard Shore on music, with one of the most iconic main themes in cinema. So iconic that they still play it at my local View to this day. Is still on the pre-film playlist.
Oh, brilliant stuff. So Lord of the Rings was released when I was 13 in my teenage years. This one was released 1 year later in 2002, so it's still fresh in the public mind. And again, it's a benefit, isn't it? A film that back to back, you can get these released out really, really quickly. And that's exactly what happened here. Andy Serkis joins as Gollum. Oh yes. Definitely.
That man has been robbed of an Oscar for motion capture since this movie.
Oh, I'm in high agreement with that. Andy Serkis should have been given the Oscar. And I just don't get. I don't get the Oscars 9 times out of 10. I don't know how I can predict them as well as I do, but it's just one of those things. And of course, when the film was released, it was released to numerous awards at the 75th Academy Awards, nominated for 6: Best Picture, Best Art Directing, Best Film Editing, Best Sound Mixing. It won the sound editing and visual effects.
Not surprisingly. There was literally no competition in those categories that year.
Exactly. It was kind of the Mad Max Fury Road of its time with its technicality.
Yeah, I remember when Mad Max won all the Oscars. A friend of mine was doing a drinking game, and they had to do a down a drink every time Mad Max won. Needless to say, he didn't see the end of the ceremony that night.
Oh dear. So now, in my opinion, the Two Towers is the weakest of the trilogy because it doesn't focus on the hobbits as much. The Two Towers is mostly a focus. It mostly focuses on the rescue attempts of Peregrine and Peregrine took and oh my god, my mind, Peregrine and Merry. That was it. Pippin and Merry. Whew. Sorry, I was really trying desperately to remember their names. Pippin and Merry. And it also, goes introduces the new character of Gandalf the White. It doesn't focus as much on the hobbits because the Lord of the Rings is ultimately about Frodo and Samwise and their journey. So
Yes.
I that's kind of what I struggled with this one. And that's the problem when you have three storylines intertwined. It can get a bit tricky. It's like, how do you balance each of the stories? Because you've got Frodo and Sam continuing their journey to destroy the One Ring. Gollum finds them, and Frodo manages to sort of, in a sense, rehabilitate Gollum into becoming his guide. And then you've got story number 2, which is Aragorn, Legolas, and Gimli coming to Rohan, reunited with Gandalf before they have to fight against Saruman, and Pippin and Merry meeting Treebeard the Ent to plan an attack on Isengard. And yeah.
There is a lot going on in this film.
There's a lot going on, yeah. And it is regarded as one of the greatest and most influential films ever made.
Oh, yeah.
And it's understandable why. Because it's the highest grossing film of 2002. And at the time of its release, it hit number 3 in the highest grossing films of all time.
Yeah.
So there is something. But again, it continues on the journey. And the way the trilogy... And I think, like I say, it's the weakest of the trilogies because the way the trilogy works is this is the peak top of the journey. You start off introducing your characters and then you get them on the way in the journey. And then the second one is where all the major action happens. And the third one is where a little bit of action happens, but they all come to the end. And then what happens next? It's... Yeah. And again, like I say, there's you've got the introduction of some more characters. Andy Serkis as Gollum, Carl Urban as Yomir, Brad Dourif, who was brilliant as Grima Wormtongue, and of course we get to see more of Christopher Lee and Saruman the White as he becomes more and more evil. And my personal favourite is Treebeard, who is John Rhys Davies, who voiced Gimli. I love John Rhys Davies. He's a great actor, and I think his Treebeard voice was just utterly fantastic. One of my favourite bits is just where he walks out into the forest, sees what has happened, and his anger just hits full tilt. And at that point, you just know things are going to go down.
Oh, yeah, well, get a nice little bit of foreshadow because, of course, Two Towers has what many people regard as one of the greatest battle sequences in cinema with the Helm's Deep sequence.
The Helm's Deep, that was brilliant. Helm's Deep, shield surfing. And that's the thing as well. Again, the Two Towers and indeed the entire trilogy, the things that it added that weren't necessarily in the book, but they worked. There's no way you would have had a shield surfing scene in many fantasy novels, but this one worked, and it worked because it's Peter Jackson doing what he does best. Yeah. And then you have, of course, the Return of the King, and the Return of the King is how you end a trilogy. Yep. It is how you end. This is how you do it. There's a reason why it won all 11 awards for which it was nominated. That's called a clean sweep, ladies and gentlemen. We call that in the industry a clean sweep. Best picture, best director, best adapted screenplay, best art direction, costume design, makeup, editing, original score, original song for Into the West, sound mixing, visual effects. It won all the awards it was nominated for, and for good bloody reason.
It tied the record for the most Academy Awards won by a single film, and it still holds the record for the highest clean sweep at the Oscars. I think maybe one or two films have come close in the years since, but I think it still ultimately holds the record.
It does hold the record, yeah, and it also held the highest grossing film released by Time Warner up until 2011.
Until Deathly Hallows happened, yeah.
Deathly Hallows was released. I don't know. But this is how you end the trilogy with, and this time the Return of the King focuses more on the hobbits this time, and it works so well as a result. We get to see the end of the journey as Frodo and Sam fight Shelob in Mordor, and then they go up and, of course, get rid of the ring. And it's just such a... It all boils down to this moment. And again, the ending where Frodo is standing above the volcano, and he looks at the ring, and Samwise is telling him, get rid of it, and at that point the ring manages to grab hold of Frodo and corrupt him. That ending, that put, like, even though I knew what was going to happen, that ending put shivers down my spine. It was just like I'd completely forgotten what was going to happen, and it was like, wow, amazing.
I can only imagine what it must have been like in a cinema at the time, seeing that ending play out. It was the Avengers Endgame of its time, because the hype was just over the three films. It just built and built and built and built, and then Return of the King comes out. People are like, "Oh my god, this film is incredible." One of the stories I've heard from projectionists at the time, because the sheer length of it, I think it was 3 hours 20 theatrical. Back in the day when View, ran by a different name of Warner Village Cinemas, there was a big PR blitz saying, we're showing Return of the King with an interval because it's that long. And then because of the fan demand's like, no, we're going to show the interval on some screenings, but on the majority of them, we're actually just going to show the film right through because you've waited this long to see this trilogy come to an end.
Yeah. And the ending does change from the books. In the books, Saruman attempts to intercept the hobbits back in the Shire. He takes over the Shire and turns it into this sort of industrial sort of wasteland, essentially, where the hobbits are all slaves. And so Frodo and Samwise have to fight off Sauron. But in the movie, so this is one of the things that happened. They obviously had to cut a lot out, and one of the things they had to cut out was Saruman's death. And I think this is probably the only thing that was wrong in the third movie, is that we don't get to see Saruman die. We're kind of robbed of that finality of that character. And Christopher Lee was not very happy at being cut from this movie either.
Well, he wouldn't, because he's Christopher Lee and he's a legend.
Yeah, and to do it like that, it's just, no, what's the point? You've gone through all that. You've listened to Christopher Lee tell you what a man sounds like being stabbed in the back. But... I don't know. Anyway, so they obviously, because Saruman dies in the third film, we don't get to see that ending. I think it works though. I think it's a lot better. I think if they came back and they had the Battle of the Shire, it would have been far too much. So I'm glad that they changed the ending of the book. And well, they didn't change that. They changed that part of the book.
Yeah.
The ending where obviously Frodo goes off to the lands beyond is still there. This is a brilliant trilogy. It was rounded off. I think the budget was 94 million, made 1.142 billion. Whew.
Highest grossing film of 2003, second highest grossing film of all time at time of release. Boom. And again, if you look at the behind the scenes footage of the final scene being shot, which is Frodo at his desk writing the last chapters, and then he turns to Sam and says, there's room for the book for your story. That's the final scene they shot. You can see that this was a passion. It became such a passionate project for everyone involved. Yep.
And nobody wanted to leave this world. In actual facts, a lot of people on the set during that scene, when it was being filmed, they were kind of like saying to Christopher, they were kind of like saying under their breath, well, Peter Jackson's got the footage. He's already filmed the scene multiple times. He's just keeping on going because he can't say goodbye, which is understandable.
It eventually turned out he couldn't say goodbye because a little over 10 years later, he'd be going back to Middle Earth.
Yeah, not sure that was the wisest decision to make.
Because the marketplace had changed quite considerably by the time The Hobbit, An Unexpected Journey, whereas I still call it The Hobbit There and Back Again, which is what it was originally going to be called. When Unexpected Journey came out, the industry had changed quite a considerable amount. Obviously, he continued to experiment because one of the things that Lord of the Rings got right was the visual effects and the cinematography. I know there was a big debate over 48 frames a second on the cinema release of Hobbit 1. He tried to get another Lord of the Rings trilogy mess. Obviously, people don't hold it as highly as the original films because, quite rightly, you don't build on perfection like that. But with the Hobbit trilogy, doing it in 2012, after people have really moved on and the industry has moved into the whole superhero realm, I don't know whether it was the right move.
No, well, the problem is the Hobbit itself is a children's story, like I said. It's got 310 pages from the first edition of the book. You know, when you compare that to the Lord of the Rings, which is a trilogy of books, it becomes there's essentially a point where you realise, to quote Bilbo Baggins, the film kind of feels like butter scraped over too much bread. And that's kind of what I felt The Hobbit was. There wasn't enough here to make a trilogy.
That's even with the involvement of Guillermo del Toro as well, who was originally set to direct those films before Peter Jackson came back in.
Yeah, and so as much as I enjoy The Hobbit, it didn't have that wow factor of The Lord of the Rings because, you know, like you say, people had moved on. We've had Harry Potter. We've had, we've had Harry Potter and all sorted out. The Lord of the Rings, had ended. And like you say, we're moving on now to superheroes.
Yeah, because when Hobbit 1 came out at the end of what was a stacked year for cinema, because we had Dark Knight Rises, we had Avengers Assemble, we had Skyfall. It was that last quarter of 2012 was like a new release every week, and I think Hobbit 1 here in the UK, it opened well, but its success was hit hard by the amount of films that cinemas had to offer, and I still hold 2012 in high regard as one of the best years for cinema we've ever had, because there was a lot of great films. So it came out at the wrong time. If he wanted to do The Hobbit properly, he could have capitalised on Lord of the Rings, not made King Kong, and actually done the Hobbit trilogy like 2005, 2006, before the industry starts moving on.
Yeah, but this is Hollywood we're talking about.
And in Hollywood, nobody knows anything.
Yeah, exactly right. So, the Hobbit, but you know, I like. But the thing about the Lord of the Rings as well is it's the perfect length and it is an epic journey. You know, everyone starts, slating the movies and go, well, why didn't the Eagles take them to the mountain if they're going to take them back? And it's just like, well, you've obviously not been paying much attention to the plot because Sauron's looking for the ring always, and he's going to spot them coming in through the sky, isn't he? The whole point of the journey with Lord of the Rings is having two unassuming creatures who are the hobbits, who are well known for eating, sleeping, smoking pipeweed, and having wonderful parties when it's their birthday. Going to the pub in the evening, rinse and repeat. That's the life of a hobbit. They don't do adventures at all. In fact, Bilbo Baggins is frowned upon by some of the circles in Lord of the Rings because of the adventures in the Hobbit. So they don't do adventures, nasty little things. They make you late for dinner. And, so to have these the hobbits as the heroes of the story. It's the whole thing about it's the whole what's it called? The theme of personal responsibility, isn't it?
Yeah,
You're given this great personal responsibility. What do you do with it? You see it to the end. And that's what the whole story is about. A lot of people think, oh, the story's about, oh, he's going to the mountain, drops the ring, comes back off again. Boring plot. And it's like, yeah, but it's what happens in between the plot. It's watching these characters. What do we do with this responsibility that we have? Because the ring represents the weight of the world. That thing is going to decide which way the good and evil goes. Is evil going to win or is good going to win? It's all decided in this ring. And it's such a brilliant trilogy. It opens up the fantasy genre to everyone. And I truly do believe as well, because, Harry Potter owes a lot of... the Harry Potter films owe a lot of success to The Lord of the Rings, because it proved that you could make an adaptation of these books that people would enjoy. Now, do I like the Harry Potter movies as much as Lord of the Rings? No. I don't. There are many things wrong with the Harry Potter movies that stop them from being great. They're just good.
Yeah.
And everyone and their dog has read the books. They're accessible to everyone. The movies, it's quite obvious what they were.
Yeah.
They were instead of introducing people to the world of Harry Potter, it was just another avenue.
Yeah, just another avenue to merchandise, get toys and books and stuff out of it. I was there on the day that Deathly Hallows Part 2 came out. I was on site watching another movie, because I made it as far as Order of Phoenix, and I realised, these films aren't worth my time anymore. Gave up on the whole young adult franchise back in 2008, before it was cool. But I was there when Deathly Hallows Part 2 came out, and the atmosphere in that place was unreal, because nobody knew what was going to unfold. And when Philosopher's Stone came out in 2001, it came out just months before Lord of the Rings. I seem to remember, I need to chat with people who worked there at the time, I think trailers for Fellowship were attached with Harry Potter. So they had the captive audience right there to get the younger fans say, oh, this is Lord of the Rings, this is what it's about, this film's coming at this time, and then a whole generation have grown up on these movies.
And the thing about Lord of the Rings, the trilogy, it's made fantasy accessible to everyone.
Yep.
It's no secret now that Dungeons and Dragons is experiencing what is a resurgence in popularity, almost similar, like a renaissance. It's now become socially acceptable to play Dungeons and Dragons.
Well, it's become socially acceptable to play tabletop games in general.
Yeah. That's true. I only say Dungeons and Dragons because that's practically the only one I generally play.
That's the big one.
Nobody's interested in the things that I want to play. But and I think that's really helped in turn with things like Lord of the Rings, because it's now made fantasy accessible to people who wouldn't normally look at it, who would look at it and go, "Oh, fantasy, that's that thing for nerds, isn't it?" It's like, no. The Lord of the Rings movies, coupled with the Harry Potter books, have made fantasy accessible to everyone. And unlike the Lord of the Rings books, no, I can't say that. That's just baiting for it. No. I was going to make a joke about how J.K. Rowling is a nasty human being.
No, let's not go down that route. Let's not go down that route. We're inclusive.
I don't have it in me. I just don't.
Neither do I.
I don't. It was going to be a stalker though. It was going to be brilliant.
Oh,
I was going to scorch her off the face. I was going to scorch her off the face of the earth. If I had the energy, I'd do it. But and the thing is, these trilogy of movies still hold up. If you go back to the 80s movies with Deathstalker, with Excalibur, with Willow, Zardoz, all these other movies that were based on Lord of the Rings, but they're very dated and for their time. You can still watch Lord of the Rings 20 years later.
Well, let's be real. Lord of the Rings is Lord of the movies because of how much success it's had.
It's Lord of the trilogies. It's brilliant. Yeah. And it's still, to this day, it holds up. You could release the whole entire trilogy, do an IMAX screening, and it would look brilliant.
Believe it or not, over the restart last year, they did.
Yep.
The very first day back open at V Preston, my local cinema, they had the whole trilogy extended all 11 hours and 26 minutes of it, and it's sold out.
Yeah.
They even put it on screen. They put it on screen 7 as well, so it was the proper scope screen, so it looked right at home in 4K.
Yeah, these are movies. These movies are going to last for years and years and years. They're going to last for a very long time. These are movies that, like, it's a trilogy that doesn't need to be remade. Because when you're having a look at the other trilogies, you're looking at like Indiana Jones, which got another movie, Back to the Future,
which we talked about last episode,
last week, where the director was like, "Yeah, over my dead gorgeous body." No, you know, these trilogies that are coming out. The Batman trilogy, is being remade. It was remade. Sorry, it wasn't being remade. It was reimagined in Zack Snyder's, and it's been reimagined again as the Batman.
Yep.
You know, but with Lord of the Rings, nobody's saying we need to redo Lord of the Rings. You don't need to. It's there. It works.
Yeah, people. Well, the only other remakes that have really happened have been radio dramas, but no one has ever dared do a filmed version since.
Yeah. There's like there's going to be sort of radio dramas. They've done like the radio drama of Lord of the Rings, but for the film version, nobody is talking about let's redo them. And technology has improved in the last 20 years.
Yeah.
They could do a lot of stuff with it, but they don't need to because it's perfect. It is a perfect trilogy.
Yes.
And I will always be thankful for Peter Jackson for creating these movies, these perfect adaptions. I will always be thankful for him for opening the realms of fantasy, because he started it, Harry Potter finished it, and I will always be thankful for him showing and really encapsulating what makes a fantasy story, you know, a fantasy story so appealing for movies. He showed it to the general public, and the general public went, yeah, we get it. We get what's amazing about it, and they loved it. And as a result, you know, we you know, the fantasy genre is it's accepted now.
Yes.
And and I love Peter Jackson for doing it. And it's kind of made me wish that I was it kind of makes me wish I was a kid again, in the sense that I could, you know, show people these cool things and everyone would be like, oh, yeah, we get it. So, but, you know, who knows? But yeah, the Lord of the Rings has made fantasy acceptable. It's made hobbies, like fantasy games, acceptable. And I look forward to seeing what happens with the fantasy genre next. I know Game of Thrones came out and it showed people that fantasy...
Well, it made fantasy cool on TV.
Well, it showed that fantasy didn't have to be happy little elves and tree sprites and hobbits, and that actually fantasy, there was a dark side to fantasy as well. And yeah, you know, it was great for all 7 seasons it was on TV, because I refused to acknowledge the 8th season.
Yeah, not many people acknowledge the fact that the 8th series came out. Yeah.
There was no 8th season. There was no 8th season. The set was hijacked.
The set was studio interference. Studio interference. That's what happened.
But yeah, I am looking forward to seeing. Oh, sorry, someone got caught in my throat there.
Oh.
But yeah, I am looking forward to seeing what happens next with the fantasy genre. I think it's high time that we had another fantasy epic. I know Warcraft tried to fill that hole.
Yeah, we back in the day we talked about the Warcraft film in another time in another place when we both did radio shows at the time, and it was when that Warcraft film came out, there was a lot of hype around it. People were thinking it was going to be a success, but ultimately studio interference got in the way of what was meant to be a faithful adaptation of the Warcraft video game that Blizzard Entertainment had made. The fans weren't happy. Casual audiences were bored out of their minds with that film. It had a lot of the lore building in place, but ultimately just didn't do it as well as Lord of the Rings did. And that's Lord of the Rings, to this day, is still the benchmark of how to do a fantasy film.
Oh, it did the same. Well, I'll end the episode by saying what Lord of the Rings did, what Warcraft didn't. it treated the audience as if it never heard of Lord of the Rings, and it didn't leave the important bits out. Warcraft was made for the fans, and the problem is that's like, it goes back to what I said in the beginning of this episode. An adaptation is for so that people can access this wonderful story originally told through a limited medium that others may not want to get into. Not everyone wants to read a huge trilogy of books. They're more visual, and not everyone wants to play a huge video game with, at the time, I think it was like 120 levels or 110 levels that you've got to progress before you get onto the main story. Some people just want to sit back and watch the movie. And Warcraft got it wrong because they play to their audience and not to the new audience, which is why they were bored. So the new audience of cinema goers, which is why the average audience was bored out of its mind. Lord of the Rings, like you say, the trilogy still remains one of the greatest hallmarks of fantasy. It is one of the greatest trilogies. It is how you tell an epic story. Cut, wrap, print, send to press.
Boom.
Or as Peter Jackson would say, right, we've got it, close the gate.
Yes. And with that is this week's Rip Ticket review in the can. Another good episode this week. Good to delve into sort of the fantasy realm for the first time as well, because we've not really done that much of that in the 2 series that we've done it. Hard to think. This week is coming up on a year since the very first show that we did. It's getting close.
Cool. I don't know what we're going to do. What's our 1 year anniversary going to be then?
I've got absolutely no clue what it's going to be, but if you're on the Facebook and Twitter pages, you'll get a heads up as to when we are on air and what topic we will be covering. Facebook.com/The Rip Ticket Show, where a lot of you are potentially watching this episode right now because we are live on both Facebook and YouTube now. Shock horror. You can also find us on Twitter at ripped_ticket, and the audio version of this podcast will be available from around 4:30 this evening UK time. Where we go from here, we absolutely don't know, but we will let you know at some point next week what we're covering when we're on air. But we've done the big films now. We've covered the big films. We've done Back to the Future and Lord of the Rings within 2 weeks of each other, which I think... Yeah. Considering where this podcast has been in previous iterations, covering really bad movies, well, so bad they're good movies, to cover 2 of the greatest trilogies of all time has been like really good. Makes a change.
Yeah, we've done well.
Yeah, and also that reminds me, for those of you who've been new to the Rip Ticket review, we did a whole 8-episode series last year which covers topics like Tommy Wiseau's The Room, the work of Uwe Boll, Bloodsport, the first Jean-Claude Van Damme film, superhero movies. We did an episode on Crow last year. An episode of Christopher Nolan. It's all on the Rip Ticket review playlist on the TheJackSmit YouTube channel. But that's it. I can't think of anything more to say. I should really think about scripting these end segments just to make my life a little bit easier. But until next week, my name's been Jack Smit.
My name's been Dan Carver.
Until we're back online at some point next week, we will see you at the movies.
Toodle pip. Bye.